Hello and welcome to this Government Connection, Regulatory Practice and a New Presidential Administration. This is Steve Springer, Director of Regulatory Practice Liaison at NAFSA, and I want to thank you for joining us today and mention that this is an unusual Government Connection in that we have experts on the law, and especially immigration law, rather than government officials as our presenters. And let me introduce them. First is Dan Berger. He's a partner at Curran & Berger, LLP. He's a frequent speaker, editor, and writer on immigration law. He won the 1995 American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, annual writing competition for an article on Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS policies toward international adoptions. Dan has also been editor for the AILA Immigration and Nationality Law Handbook since 2000 and edited Immigration Options for Academics and Researchers, 2005 and 2011 editions, the International Adoption Sourcebook, and the Diplomatic Visa Guide. He's written on a wide variety of topics, including outstanding professor or researcher, green cards, temporary visa D3 waivers, green cards for Iraqi and Afghan translators, use of DNA evidence in immigration cases, and the elements of immigration law for in-house legal counsel. Steve Lair is an attorney in Miller & Mayer LLP's Immigration Practice Group. He brings 30 years of immigration law experience to bear in advising corporate and individual clients on a broad array of family and employment-based immigration matters. Steve is active and internationally renowned member of the immigration law community, and he also teaches immigration and asylum law at Cornell Law School as a professor of immigration practice. He also founded and was the original executive director of Invest in the USA, a trade association of EB-5 immigrant investor regional centers. He's the 2001 recipient of AILA's Elmer Fried Award for Excellence in Teaching and the 2004 recipient of AILA's Edith Lowenstein Award for Excellence in Advancing the Practice of Immigration Law. Steve has also co-authored or edited a number of books, including Immigration Law and Procedure, the leading 20-volume treatise on U.S. immigration law, Green Card Stories, and America's Challenge, Domestic Security, Civil Liberties, and National Unity after September 11. He received his JD degree from Cornell University and his BA from Cornell University. So let me mention today's agenda. What I'll do is, after mentioning a few housekeeping items, I'll then mention some of the ways you can get involved in advocating for international education. I'll offer a quick sort of 30,000 view review of the U.S. legal system, U.S. legal authority, and how we get statutes and regulations. I'll mention a few resources, and then our experts will address your questions, including the ones you submitted to me in advance of the Government Connection today. I know that you want to hear from them, so I promise to be quick with my portion. So again, today we'll focus primarily on having Dan and Steve address your questions. And so please start sending those in now. You can use the chat box. My colleague David Fosnock, the Director of Regulatory Practice Resources, and I are here watching, and we'll grab your questions and try to pass them, try to verbally present them to Dan and Steve. Now, please remember that they can't know, none of us can know with certainty what to expect from a new administration. But Steve and Dan are immigration law experts who advise educational institutions and individuals, and I think you'll be happy to hear from them about what they're watching, what they're thinking about, and any insights that they have for us at this point. Okay, a couple of more housekeeping items. Specific predictions and advice. We cannot, sorry. It's probably obvious, and I don't need to say it, but we will not be giving a lot of specific predictions and advice today. As you know, it's too early really to tell how President-elect Trump's policies will impact international students and those who may want to come to the U.S. You also know that campaign rhetoric and actual policy are often two different things. And again, at this point, it's just not possible for us to know what the new administration's policies will be. We NAFSANs can continue doing what we do. We'll be advocating for the U.S. to make international education a top priority because the world we live in now requires American students to be able to understand and communicate across cultures and international students play a key role in enriching our campuses and communities. In addition to the innumerable academic and cultural benefits international students bring, you well know that they also contribute more than $32.8 billion to the economy and more than 400,000 jobs. So again, we'll be watching and responding to the new administration as we move along. So I want to mention just a couple of things about how you can stay up to date and how you can start doing some advocacy or keep doing some advocacy. Stay informed by checking the Reg Info page, and that's the first link that I have cited there. And please consider joining Connecting Our World and encourage friends and family to sign up. This is not only for NAFSANs. And share on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, other social media. You'll get from Connecting Our World valuable action alerts. And as you know, we have a lot of advocacy work ahead of us. If you haven't already signed up for Connecting Our World, please do. It's a community of individuals raising their voices in support of international education and more globally engaged and welcoming United States. We advocate for policies that foster a more peaceful world, result in common sense immigration process, and encourage enlightened global engagement and sustained and informed civic culture through international education. In short, it's our grassroots advocacy tool, so it's a great way for you to get involved in advocating for international education. And let me also mention that Advocacy Day is coming up in March. This is a great opportunity for you to raise your voice in support of international education and to advocate for international education. So check this out and consider joining us in D.C. for Advocacy Day. Now, again, we could do a long, sort of boring civics lesson here that I know that most of you don't need. And I'm going to try to avoid that and just do a sort of quick little refresher on some of the sort of 30,000-foot view of statutes, regulations, where they come from, how we get them, and so forth. So remember, the hierarchy, a lot of you have seen this before, the old hierarchy of authority. This has not changed. It remains the same, and despite late-night Twitter warfare that may indicate otherwise, the Constitution remains in effect and has not changed. It's the supreme law of the land and sets out the separation of powers in our government, the executive power, the legislative power, and the judicial power. It also provides a means for ensuring that state and federal laws comply with it or that they are not unconstitutional. Now, the President can issue executive orders. You know, though, that if you have followed President Obama's deferred action for parents of Americans and lawful permanent residents, the so-called DACA executive orders, which were basically an exercise in prosecutorial discretion that would allow these folks temporary relief from deportation and provide work authorization. If you have followed that, you know that executive orders can be challenged in court and enjoined by the court or basically killed by the court. So you know also that Congress makes the laws or the federal statutes, and that when it makes laws, it generally gives agencies the authority to make the regulations that are necessary to implement the laws. Again, if you have followed a couple of recent ones, for example, DOL's overtime regulations issued in May 2016, or even if you followed the WashTech case, which challenged the STEM OPT regulations, you'll also know that regulations can be challenged in court and delayed or invalidated. So it's important to remember, I think, as we go along that agencies have established processes to follow in creating regulations, and they remain the same. Generally speaking, agencies are required to publish regulations, we call them rules, in the Federal Register for public comment. That remains the same. So that's what's going to happen if we see new rules being developed. We will see them in the Federal Register. We will most often have a chance to comment. You can know about this by following the NAFSA website, especially the Reg Info page that I mentioned earlier, and the NAFSA Advisor's Manual news feed. We'll keep you up to date on new rules that we see coming out. We'll ask you for your input for our comment letters, and we hope that you will also submit comment letters about new rules and regulations. Now, finally, it's important to remember that the President does not amend the Constitution, does not make laws, does not even create regulations. Granted, the president appoints heads of certain agencies, and they can definitely influence the regulations created by the civil servants who create regulations for the agency, but again, it is not the president who writes regulations. Okay. It's probably most important for us to take away from my little part of this today that the way the hierarchy of authority works out in our day-to-day work is that agency policies must conform to regulation. Regulations must conform to statutes. Statutes must conform to the Constitution. New administrations don't just come into office with a clean slate. They face many checks and balances on their powers. Granted, they can affect big changes. I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish about that, but I just want you to keep in mind as we go along that there are very well-created, well-established processes for all of this, and there are checks and balances. So keep this in mind as we move along. And finally, let me just touch quickly on NAFSA agency engagement, which is the area in which I work at NAFSA. We are going to keep doing this just as vigorously as we always have. We have good professional relationships with all of our liaison partners, and they are all civil servants at the agencies. There's no reason to expect that they're going to change or that our relationships with them are going to change. As I said before, the processes for responding to agency initiatives like new regulations, that has not changed. So we're going to keep doing that, and we're going to keep doing our work as we've always done it. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the Obama administration placed a whole lot of emphasis on stakeholder engagement. So that's one reason you saw a lot of agencies creating offices of public engagement in recent years and so forth. So that could definitely change, but we don't know that for sure. We're just going to have to wait and see whether the current administration will be just as open to stakeholder engagement as the administration was in the Obama era. Again, we're going to have to wait and see how it goes. Now finally, to my last bit of this, I want to mention some resources. And I think the main thing I want to do is just mention the town hall short link at the top up there. It's nafsa.org/townhall. You may recall that we had a town hall a while back, and there was a great resource created for that. And that's where we've been updating regularly all of our resources. So if you attended the town hall and saw it, it's been updated a lot since you saw it. And I'll just mention a few things that we've added to it. Steve Yell-Lair, one of our presenters today, has got a couple of great videos, or a great video available in a couple of places. So here's a link to those. And they are also in the town. If you go to the town hall resource, you'll see the same links there. Educators for Fair Consideration, Dan Berger is involved in that. They've got a great resource on Beyond Deferred Action. Another thing you might want to see is the AILA President Bill Stock, who many of you know is a former RegBot and NAFSA leader, is now president of AILA and has got a nice little video on sort of what AILA is thinking about the Trump administration. I'm pretty sure this is available to the public. At least it was when I went there. The American Immigration Law Council, always great resources. It's got a great set of Know Your Rights resources on how the immigration system works. Many of you who attended the town hall know that there was a discussion of a Penn State Law School resource. We've got that cited there, and also, again, cited in the town hall resource that you can find at the link at the top. And finally, American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, has an extensive Know Your Rights library, including a good tool for immigration-related Know Your Rights. Okay. So finally, to the important part of the afternoon, or yes, afternoon here, so I guess it's morning for some of you still. We're going to ask Dan and Steve to give us some insights on kind of what they're watching for, what they're concerned about, and maybe generally how they're advising clients or talking to clients about this whole situation. And as I mentioned, my colleague David Fosnock and I here at the NAFSA office are going to be watching your questions, so keep them coming in through the chat function. And with that, I'll turn it over we'll start with you, Dan.
All right. Thanks very much, Steve. And I think those resources that you put in are great. Steve and I were talking before the call, and there's a lot of passion, a lot of interest, and a lot of speculation about what might happen. And so one of our goals is to try to make sure that there's good information, that things that people are worried about or thinking are based on the reality of the law. So we'll look forward to hearing some more of your questions.
And this is Steve Yellaire. I think basically, and when you ask Steve Springer as to what are we advising clients, it depends on who the client is. If it's an individual student who's worried, as we'll talk about in some of the questions, we're basically saying, well, what are your other immigration options that you might need to consider now? If we're advising campus general counsel, the questions are, what policy should a campus have now in light of the possible revocation of DACA or increased screening of certain international students? So we'll address all those questions as they come up in the chat box.
Okay, great. So someone asked, and maybe I'll also just take a shot at this and ask you guys to do so too, sort of, and this will be, what I say will not be all that, it will not be sage, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. So, people are saying, look, we've got to tell something to, what can we say to our students and to our campus colleagues who are really worried and so forth about what's going on. And again, I think what I would say is what I tried to say earlier. And again, I don't mean to sort of sugarcoat any of this, but it's early. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. Campaign rhetoric and policies are not always the same. So I think we all sort of need to take a deep breath, watch very carefully, maybe more carefully than ever, what's coming out of the government, and use our tools for responding, like Connecting Our World, Advocacy Day, and any others that you can think of. Do you guys have any other thing that you would tell people at campuses who are trying to manage a lot of heightened anxiety?
Well, this is Steve. I'll start and say this is not really a new phenomenon. It's just a different variation on an old phenomenon. We had the same kind of issues after 9/11. Or anytime anyone gets arrested on a campus. You have the issues of what is campus policy in terms of what information can we or must we disclose to government officials. So we have a different spin on it now in terms of undocumented students, but campuses should be reviewing their general policies on how they treat information requests from outside authorities. And maybe they need to do retraining of those officials to make sure they're up to date on all of those. But there's nothing that different just about the fact that now we're worried about undocumented students as when we were worried after 9/11 about increased screenings of Muslim students, for example.
No, I agree, and as sort of two little footnotes on that, there have been undocumented students on campuses for a long time. I think we know more about them because DACA has allowed many of them to come out in the open. But I was just looking back at an article that Steve had written in 2002 about undocumented students on campuses.
Are you guys assuming that DACA is going to be quickly eliminated?
I think it will be eliminated. I'm not sure how quickly it will be eliminated. President Trump, like any new president, has an awful lot on his plate. And although he said he planned to revoke DACA on the first day in office, we don't know if he's going to have everything in place to be able to do that. His appointments will not be confirmed by then, for example. So I'm not positive that we will see a revocation on day one. It could well be that nothing happens for several months, and then all of a sudden we have something that occurs, some terrorist attack in the United States, and that prompts, the immediate cessation of DACA. Dan?
No, I agree, and I think another thing that we've been trying to look at is what would it look like if DACA were taken away. There are a variety of ways that could happen. One way would be just to simply stop doing extensions, so DACA would disappear slowly. Another thing is to take it away by the stroke of a pen, just the way it was created, and that would be much more disruptive, and obviously. And if that happened, there are some interesting questions about the work cards that all of these DACA students have, because there is a formal process for revoking work cards that involves a notice of intent to revoke and a 15-day notice. In liaison meetings, the Immigration Service, in other contexts, has said that they don't have time to do this, basically. So it would be interesting and something we really would have to study very carefully. If DACA does disappear at the end of January 2017, what happens to all those work cards, and are they arguably still valid if they haven't been revoked? So a lot to look at.
And just to elaborate on that, just think about it from a bureaucracy point of view. USCIS would have to send out over 700,000 notices of intent to revoke work authorization. That's a massive amount of work for any agency. And if they simply try to bypass the regulation, there would certainly be litigation challenging the fact that they did not follow their own procedures. So I think that even if DACA is revoked immediately, the work authorizations will be continuing, and at least till an individual's work authorization otherwise expires.
Exactly.
Great point. Dan, I should mention that some people are mentioning that they can't really hear you, so if you could speak a little closer to the phone, I think that would be helpful. And maybe while we're on DACA, I know we have some of our Ed Abroad colleagues on the call today. Thank you for joining. And so let me ask you a DACA-related question that I think a lot of them will be interested in. What do you think about DACA students studying abroad now under the Trump administration?
I'm nervous about it, and please, I moved the phone a little closer, so tell me if this is working. But I think Steve and I both agree that anybody who is currently studying abroad or doing any kind of research or travel on DACA should come back by Inauguration Day. There's just too much uncertainty about how and what could happen. And as I was saying, if DACA is revoked with the stroke of a pen on January 20th, there are issues about what that means for the work cards, but there aren't really issues about what that means for DACA. If somebody is out of the country and DACA is revoked, that person would not have a way of getting back into the country. So unfortunately, it's been a really tremendous experience for a lot of DACA students, a lot of undocumented students who got DACA who never dreamed of being able to do a study abroad program, have been able to do it over the past 6 years, and I can't say that I've heard of anybody who's of the probably tens of thousands who have studied abroad who have had any problem traveling on that DACA travel authorization. But as a practical matter, I think everybody should come back to the United States, not plan to study abroad in spring of 2017, and let's wait and see what happens.
Yeah, that seems like great advice, and maybe the most certain sort of concise piece of advice we can give today. So I guess people have asked a lot of questions, and I know these are going to be hard, so I'm sort of hesitant to toss it out at you, but let me just go ahead and do it. So a lot of the questions that have come in have said basically, do you guys have any particular concerns, or what's sort of your worst case scenario, which I sort of hate to delve in, about blank, and then fill in the blank with all of the programs of interest to NAFSANs, F1, M1, H1B, employment-based green cards, TPS, special student relief. Are you particularly concerned about any of these things, and what's your sort of, I guess, worst case scenario, if you have any in mind right now?
Let me start with that. This is Steve. I think it also have to think about it. What are we talking about, the short term, or are we talking about the longer term? I think in the short term, we need to focus on what are those actions that President Trump can take on his own without having to get Congress involved that would adversely affect NAFSANs and international students. And in that regard, I think it is clearly DACA. On the longer term, there are other possible problems. For example, Jeff Sessions really does not like immigration generally. So I could see that as an attorney general, if he gets confirmed, he may try to push through legislation or regulations that increase the prevailing wage requirement for H-1Bs, or that otherwise restrict the ability of international students to get green cards. But those are much more in the distance, because most of those would require, at the very least, regulatory changes, which will take at least months, if not years. And some of those would require statutory changes, which would mean that the Congress would have to enact them. So I think it depends on your time focus in answering that question. Dan?
Yeah, I agree. We were sort of looking through a few different statutes this morning, and I want to thank David Fosnacht, who's vetting the questions today, for pointing some of these out. There are sections of federal law that that do give broad powers to a president to do certain things, and I think we're all just going to have to watch this. One is Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act that basically gives very broad powers to the government to designate certain groups of people for additional scrutiny. And that's as vague as it sounds. And after 9/11, we saw some of these things used against people from predominantly Muslim countries. For those of you who are interested, INA 264 gives the government power to mandate registration of certain groups, and that sounds unconstitutional, and arguably it is. And for those of us who studied Japanese internment and various other things, it's of concern. But this is the kind of thing that brought us special registration, which was the registration program after September 11th that lasted 10 years for people from any one of 26 predominantly Muslim countries. And also the Patriot Act does allow certain exceptions to student privacy records. It basically allows the government to go to a court and express terrorist concerns and get a warrant that get around a lot of the federal student record privacy laws. So I think it will be, I agree with Steve that I don't think it's going to be possible for anything to happen too quickly, and anything that does happen will certainly be challenged in court. There's no question that that there are a lot of people who are very ready to watch everything this new administration says. But there are provisions in federal law that do give the administration leeway to do some troubling things.
And just to add to what Dan just said, in addition to normal FERPA, a lot of people in F&J visas have largely waived their rights under FERPA through the visa process, and institutions by signing as petitioners for H-1B or O-1 or other visa petitions have effectively agreed to grant access to certain employment-related information. So while we may think that there is this wall of privacy protecting students' information, there are a lot of holes in that cheese, and so the government can get a lot of information if they know how to do it properly.
That's true. And I think sorry, Steve.
No, go ahead, Dan. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, as a practical matter, over the last 8 years of the Obama administration, I think I won't say universities have gotten soft, but I think if you visit universities now, there's less people are policies are less clear about FERPA, which is the student privacy law, and what a government official can do on campus. There was a lot of vigilance after September 11th, and now we're starting to see, some of the CVIS representatives are actually former foreign student advisors. They're your colleagues in the audience, and sometimes, more recently when they come onto campus, we're more relaxed. But I think we have to realize that in the future, these are government officials, and they do have to follow the law about what they're allowed to look at, what they're allowed to ask for, and where they're allowed to be.
Great. I'll address one quick good question. There are a bunch of questions came in about DACA, and let me try to summarize a couple of them. So one was about sort of how we can assist DACA students who want to study abroad. And I think the simplest advice is you've got to get them to talk to a qualified, experienced immigration attorney, because either it's going to be impossible or very difficult after a lengthy legal process for them to be able to come back to the U.S. after leaving. So it is super high stakes. Don't feel like as a campus-based employee of a university you should be advising about that. Send them out to qualified immigration law counsel. Somebody mentioned, what's the likelihood of the government using DACA information for enforcement or removal? And this is a great point. This is something that everybody was kind of, it was the kind of a scary part of DACA, even to the people who welcomed it, was that, people are basically coming forward and saying, well, here I am and I'm undocumented. So we don't know anything about that yet. It's troubling, and it's certainly something to watch for. Do you guys have anything else to say about that?
Well, I would just say, this is Dan, that current immigration policy, written policy regarding DACA is not to use is that DACA data will not be disclosed to Immigration and Customs Enforcement or Border Protection for any kind of immigration enforcement proceeding. but obviously that could be changed. So we do have to be, we just have to be ready for anything. And I think one thing I would say, if you, as a practical matter, to help DACA and undocumented students on your campus, because there are students who didn't qualify for DACA who are still undocumented, who are on campuses. I think it's very important for all of them, as you said, to look into their options. Some students have gotten very used to being on DACA, and after 6 years here, may have options to move on to a longer-term status. And the one thing we can say with certainty is that having a longer-term status is going to be better than staying on DACA. And there was one link, Steve, in your from E4FC and as a resource called Beyond Deferred Action, and that basically surveys the most common remedies that immigration remedies that DACA students or undocumented students might be able to use. And it was estimated back in 2012 that about 25% of undocumented students had some kind of remedy that they may not have been aware of. So I think screening now, and also getting basic know your rights information. If somebody is undocumented, it's very important for them to have the name of an attorney or the name of a legal clinic, in their wallet, and to be ready if they do get into trouble.
And just to add what Dan just said, in terms of it's not current USCIS policy to turn over its information to ICE or CBP. That is true. It comes from 2011, so it's been around for 5 years, but it is an internal policy. So if they want to change that, they can do so without having to go through the regulatory process. Similarly, a lot of students have pointed out, that ICE has a current sensitive locations policy, that that policy discourages ICE officials from going to sensitive locations like schools. And that's great, but again, it's an internal policy, and if the new administration wants to change that, they can do so just by writing a new policy. So we need to be aware and concerned about that.
And in terms of specific advocacy, as you're talking to your government relations offices at your schools, whether they want to do this publicly or just in private meetings with congressional offices, I think in addition to advocating in general for undocumented students, advocating for keeping those two policies, sensitive locations and non-disclosure of DACA data, are really important.
Good point. And I think also you might want to just go out and Google Sanctuary Campus. To be honest, I am not all that well versed on it at the moment. I've been kind of down in the weeds since the election, but I know our public policy department is following it closely. So go Google Sanctuary Campus, and you'll see what some people are doing, thinking about, and arguing about.
And in that regard, if I could add, Steve, there are probably over 300 colleges now that are either circulating petitions or have signed petitions, and they're all over the place in terms of what they say they will do or won't do. And Dan Berger and I have researched this pretty well, and we think that while they contain some symbolism, they don't have a lot of legal meaning, because when push comes to shove, if immigration officials can get a warrant, they can come on campus. So I think that people should not be thinking that sanctuary campus petitions signed by their president are somehow going to shield them from ultimate immigration enforcement if immigration officials really wanted to come on campus.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good point, and I'm not trying to hawk a NAFSA product here, but there is a webinar on FERPA and releasing documents to the government, and there's some other NAFSA regional presentations I think that you can find just by Googling them about like how campuses should interact with federal agencies, in the immigration realm. Sorry, Dan, I think I cut you off.
No. I think that's a great resource, and I think in a lot of ways the best thing a campus can do is to just reevaluate its own policies and make sure that they understand what the law is. Since you're hawking a NAFSA product, I also wanted to mention that there will be a NACUA call, a National Association of College and University Attorneys, on December 8th that will include some discussion of sanctuary campuses, I believe, so you can tell your in-house counsel. And Steve and I have also been working on a brief for the American Council on Education that includes a good section on sanctuary campus and DACA and other things, and that, I believe, will be coming out today or tomorrow.
Great. We will definitely add that to our link to that to our resource as well. And for those of you who've just joined, let me mention that If you go to the NAFSA page and use the short link Town Hall, you'll see a resource there, and at least for right now, that's where we're putting all of our stuff. And in fact, we've got a great, David Fosnack put together a great bit on DACA, and it will help you sort of walk through the logic of how you might want to be interacting with people on campus about DACA. I think it's very helpful background. Yeah, it's all one word, Town Hall, TOWNHALL.
And Steve Springer, if I could just add to a point we made earlier, and that is, partly is re-educating campus officials about these general policies. And it's not just educating, ISSO or general counsel. It's educating everyone who may come in contact with international students, so they're aware of what the university policy is, including campus police. It's been a long time, at least here at Cornell, where campus police have had to worry about FBI agents coming on campus. And so I think it's time for a refresher for everyone to understand what they can and cannot do in this context.
Great point. And we'll probably have lots of regional conference presentations on that, and maybe at the NAFSA annual conference as well. So stay tuned for that. So I think several times you guys have mentioned NSEERS, and some people have been asking questions about that, and I know there's been a lot of buzz about it. So, the hard question is, will it be implemented again? And maybe I'll toss that to you guys. But first, let me mention that AILA, which is the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and NAFSA and a bunch of other organizations are trying to persuade the White House to basically rescind the NSEERS regulation. The regulation remains in place, although the countries that were identified as having to register under that, we've now removed them. But the regulation still remains in place, at least is my understanding, that would allow a future kind of NSEERS. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about that. Do you guys have anything to say about that? What is that a prediction that you make we've got to be looking at or could come back?
That's a hard one to answer. And on the one hand, the campaign rhetoric has been pretty strident, and Trump said he wanted to have extreme vetting, not just of Syrian refugees, but of everyone coming to the United States. So if you follow that logic, then NSEERS or some kind of special registration could certainly be in the cards. And again, because that regulation still exists, it's something that a new administration could do without having to seek the approval of Congress or go through the regulatory process. Again, it's hard to predict because, the new administration is going to be busy on a lot of fronts. And if things are relatively quiet on immigration and we don't have any terrorist acts that occur in early 2017, maybe we won't see registration. But, one terrorist attack, like we had earlier this week in Ohio State, could prompt, a new kind of registration program from being implemented the next day.
Great. Thanks. Good point. So somebody asked for it. I think it's a great question, and I'm not sure I'm fully prepared to go into it, but a quick rundown of executive orders and actions. Let me basically say that these are policies that are pretty easily implemented or changed or revoked by a president without a lot of input from Congress or the public. As I mentioned in my introductory information, there are checks and balances on these. The Obama administration has had some challenged in court and basically killed. So these aren't, executive actions aren't things that can be done willy-nilly without any review. But I think those are of great concern if you don't like the president, and they are a huge opportunity if you do like the president, right? So do you have anything else to say about that issue?
Well, this is Dan. I think it's true, and the Obama administration did use executive action, and I remember being at an immigration conference after I think he had been in office 2 years where he spoke, and the president spoke through video link and basically said, I'm not getting anywhere with Congress, and at some point I'm going to have to act on my own. And DACA, for example, was a tremendous change, but it was it does open up the possibility that another president could do something like that. I think beyond executive action, I think there is a question of tone, and that could be set by the people who he appoints, as Steve was saying, Trump was supported by the the enforcement union. That's unusual for them to support a presidential candidate. I think we can all be cautiously concerned about what the tone will be like for some of our international students. We all know that international students and scholars sometimes don't travel with the right documents or have a complicated story, and it's the individual officers, the customs enforcement officers, the customs and border protection officers, who really set the tone for what their experience will be like, and whether they try to work together or whether they're yelled at or delayed for a long time. And so it will be, I think we're just going to have to be very careful and to try to gather information about what kind of security delays and possibly even harassment is happening at different border entry posts.
And I have two things to add to that. First, on the original question about are there other things the President can do, in addition to the specific executive actions like DACA, as Dan had pointed out earlier, INA Section 212F grants the President broad power to suspend the entry of any individual or class of any individuals who are deemed to be detrimental to the national security of the United States. And he can do that simply by issuing a proclamation. So again, that's not an executive action, but it's like an executive action. And once that's published in the Federal Register, it becomes the new requirement. Now, typically, presidents have only invoked 212F for narrow situations like suspending the entry of a particular dictator from another country. In my immigration law and procedure treatise, I counted, I think there were 46 people in 2015 who were not allowed entry into the United States under 212F. But there's nothing in that provision that prevents a president from doing so on a much broader scale. And second, to elaborate on what Dan just pointed out, in terms of not just hassles at the border, but also with visa petitions. Again, the tone from the top at USCIS or DHS may be that adjudicators are going to look much harder at a regular visa application. An H-1B or a change to an F-1 may take longer. There may be more requests for evidence. And so I think we all have to prepare for more work for us, even in the day-to-day routine of helping our international students.
And I think, Steve, you've done a great job of putting together some resources for people who want to advocate for the most obvious issues, the DACA students, the undocumented students, Muslim students. There are also some good websites like immigrationimpact.org, which has very good information that you can, just to help get good information out there about the benefits of immigrants in our community economically and so forth. And then CompeteAmerica.org is a group of businesses who are working together to try to advocate for sensible business policies. And again, although we're concerned about the undocumented and DACA recipients, there is also some wondering about what will happen to business immigration. And we were just looking this morning at Jeff Sessions' immigration plan from 2015 that involved a lot of statistics, which I'm not so sure about, showing that there really is no need for international workers in the STEM field, and that's because there are many U.S. workers who can't find 11 million U.S. workers who can't find jobs in the STEM field, and that's so I think we all need to be watching every area of immigration law.
Yeah, good point. So I guess a couple of people asked, could the H-1B program be in danger? Could OPT be in danger? And I think the short answer would be, one way that we would know about that is I think it would require primarily the issuance of new regulations to do away with the old ones, sort of. Yes, I guess there's some, there's always some risk, but I don't know how realistic it is. I think we're back to the same thing I keep saying, which is I think we're going to just have to watch and see. And I don't know if you have anything else to add about the H-1B or optional practical training future of those.
No, I'd say that those, again, as you mentioned, could go through another regulatory process, but we just came out with a final rule that finally implemented after 16 years the AC-21 statute. So, the regulatory process, particularly in the immigration field, is very slow. And so although we may see some proposed regulations that are bad, I'm not particularly concerned that they're going to become actual new regulations anytime soon.
Great. Okay, good point. Let's see. So we got lots and lots of great. One thing I wanted to ask is I don't have much insight about this, but I guess now there are obviously ed abroad programs to Cuba. Everybody's loving those, and so are those at risk? And how much is the new open situation with Cuba at risk? Again, I would say we're going to have to watch and see, but I don't know if you have anything to add about that.
I don't.
Okay, so watch and see. Good question, and a very important one to be watching. So this is kind of inside baseball, and again, I don't have any inside knowledge about this, but how likely is a comprehensive immigration reform law between now and January, or even after January?
I do a lot of legislative watching and talking to members of Congress. There's certainly not going to be anything introduced before January, and I think that even after January, we will not see what I would call a comprehensive immigration reform bill introduced. I could see a border security bill being introduced, since that's the highest priority within immigration for President-elect Trump. So we could see efforts to beef up border security, more detention of people who cross illegally, an expanded definition of who is a criminal alien. But I do not see any real appetite for legalization, for example, as part of that package.
Good. Yeah, and for the folks sending in questions about record retention and release for DACA students, let me just give you, again, a not super helpful but short answer, which I think is the best one, which is get together with your university council about that. That's not something that you should be deciding in a vacuum. I don't even know if many of you would have these records, but work with your university council on any kind of record release or retention. And, that's basically one of the fundamental things that keeps getting repeated in the webinars that we've done on this topic. Be sure to work with your university council with records issues. How can people impact Trump's cabinet choices? Are there any ways to do that?
Yes, indirectly. I mean, the cabinet choices are subject to a confirmation hearing by Senate. So certainly you can talk with your senator as to why you think a particular cabinet choice should or should not be confirmed. But that's about the most that you can do. Dan?
Certainly, I agree. I think the only other thing that I would say is that there tends to be the voices, the anti-immigration voices in our country are much louder in some ways than the pro-immigration voices. And I remember maybe 10 years ago talking to Senator Kennedy's staff when he was our senator here in Massachusetts, and they were saying that they get calls 5-1 against H-1B visas, and that doesn't reflect Massachusetts or the average voter, but it reflects the fact that people who are anti-immigrant are very organized. And so I think what we can try to do is as a university or as individuals, try to express to our congressional representatives that these things are important and that we do care, and that it is important for universities to be able to get H-1Bs and to have Muslim students coming to campus and so forth. And it may not affect, certain people may still be confirmed, but I think it could at least set the tone for what kind of questions are being asked at the hearings, and maybe just show that Congress is watching.
Great. And someone asked, would our CBIS certification be at risk if we become a sanctuary campus? And I think, the short answer to that would be, I know that from time to time, we hear government officials in an informal setting, say at a conference, mention that you can put your CBIS certification at risk by having, undocumented students on your campus. But I believe that's incorrect and a drastic overstatement, and you would want to talk to your university council about that. Many of them have much deeper concerns about not admitting undocumented students. So, but there is definitely no sort of, law that anybody can identify right now that would say, if you accept undocumented students, or if you become a sanctuary campus, your SEVIS ability could be compromised. Again, something we'll have to watch.
Right. And Steve, just to mention, this American Council on Education brief that will be coming out sometime this week does touch on those issues, and I think there are really three concerns. One is about university action. One might be maintaining a SEVIS program. Another is that there's a very general federal law on harboring of undocumented immigrants, and there are also some concern. There have been some concerns raised about federal funding, whether federal funding could be at risk if, depending on what universities do. So I think these are important discussions to have on campus. It doesn't seem as a, and we can certainly talk more about those, but those would be the three main issues.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's a great point, and that's why most of your university council will know immigration counsel, who they can turn to for questions like these, like Dan and Steve. Oh, let's see, lots and lots of other good questions. I think you may have touched on this, but let me just ask it in case it wasn't clear. So, do you think at this point there's any reason for students with valid documents, maintaining their status with a valid visa, to be worried about travel abroad and reentry? Now, we talked about how risky travel would be for DACA students, but now let's just talk about non-immigrant students in general. What do you think about that?
This is Steve. To start with, I think it really depends on what country they're from and whether they need to get their visa renewed when they step out of the United States, whether they're going to return on their existing visa. So I can see a spectrum of possible issues. For example, if I were from the United Kingdom and I had an F1 visa and I did not need to get it renewed when I go back to London for the holidays, I don't anticipate any problem, returning and having any problems at JFK when I come back into the United States. By contrast, if I'm from Saudi Arabia and I need to renew my F1 visa when I go home from the holidays, you don't know what's going to happen in early or late January with the new Trump administration and whether they impose new screening procedures that could, at the very least, delay a return of a student. I would hope that wouldn't happen, and I would think timing-wise, for most students, they'll be back in the United States before the Trump administration starts, but still there could be some problems if they're delayed overseas. Dan?
And the only thing I would add to that would be criminal issues. Students do get arrested sometimes mistakenly, sometimes not mistakenly. So I think any kind of criminal issue, no matter how minor, could be a problem for travel, and that includes anybody with DACA who may have been arrested after getting DACA. So I would always recommend any student who has been arrested, once that record is in the system, I think they should talk to an immigration lawyer or get advice before leaving the country.
Yeah, it's a great point. And so somebody has asked, what are the prospects of continued visa exemptions, such as the visa waiver program or the ability for Canadians to enter without a visa? And I don't know what you think. Those seem like fairly low priorities to me. There are people, I'm sure all NAFSANs know about this if you follow the news, there are people and politicians who are very much against any kind of work authorization for non-immigrants, such as practical training or H-1Bs. Now, granted, particularly for the H-1B program, there are a lot of constituents who love that and need it as well, like business, for example. So, but yeah, what about the visa waiver program, Canadian entry without visa?
Well, I'll say quickly, the visa waiver program comes from statute and regulation. So again, that would be more difficult to change. I could see limitations coming up based on either criminal record or some kind of affiliation with Islam, unfortunately. I don't know if specifically putting in a Muslim test would make sense or be constitutional, but as they did with NSEERS, where they just picked 26 predominantly Muslim countries and said these are countries where there's more terrorism, so or arguably is more terrorism, so we're going to institute more security delays, call-in registration, and so forth. So I could see things getting worse for, let's say, somebody who has a UK passport but was born in Iran. That person probably has always been concerned about travel and security delays, and that could get worse. Steve?
If I want to add to that, in terms of NAFTA, we've had some questions about, Trump has said he wants to terminate NAFTA, and would that mean that my TN visa would go away? I've done a little bit of research on this, and technically NAFTA is a trade agreement, not a treaty. And under the terms of NAFTA, the United States could withdraw from NAFTA upon a 6-month written notice. And it appears that's something that the president could do without congressional approval. But I don't think he's really going to withdraw from NAFTA. I mean, the economic benefits of NAFTA are pretty significant. So I think that NAFTA will continue and that TN work authorization will continue.
Great, thanks. Well, we've got about 3 minutes left, so I want to give you guys a chance for your closing statement. And let me mention to everybody that, as I've said many times, sorry if it's repetitive, but all of the resources that we're mentioning will be at the town hall short link, www.nafsa.org/townhall, all one word. And we'll add everything to that. All the links on the slides today, they're in that resource. We'll put on the government connection page, which is, let me give you the short link for that. It's www.nafsa.org/government connection, all one word. If you'll go there, that's where we'll put a copy of the slides, the recording. You'll find the recording of this there. And and eventually we'll probably move the town hall resource to something else, but we'll make it easy for you to find it. And so with that, let me just turn it over to you guys and see if you have any last words of wisdom for us.
Well, let me start. I think in terms of just summarizing what we've talked about, I think that we should all be aware of the possible things happening, including increased immigration enforcement, increased compliance requirements even under existing regulations, effectively harder adjudication standards for existing visa categories, even if there's no regulatory changes, increased security checks and longer delays for people getting into the United States. So I think those are the short-term issues that we're all going to have to face. I think in the longer term we may see some regulations or statutes being proposed, at least, that would make it harder on the legal immigration side in terms of higher wage requirements, maybe restrictions on labor certification, because Trump has said he wants to protect U.S. workers. Unfortunately, we're all going to have to work a lot harder in 2017 than we have been recently. Dan?
No, thanks, and I agree. Just three specific things I might mention that we could do is, one, I think everybody should make connections as we're doing today and have a call list. If things happen, make sure you have a good relationship with your general counsel, with your government relations people, with your campus police, and even if you think you do, have these discussions again, so that if there is a change or a scare or a rumor or a student in a difficult situation, that you know who to call. And we're trying to do the same thing with students. We're going around to different campuses, meeting with undocumented students, either individually or in groups, and making sure they know, making sure they have a connection, making sure they understand their situation, and making sure they know who to call if there is a difficult situation. And beyond that, I think I don't mean to repeat myself, but I think advocacy is important through the groups that Steve mentioned, and also through your campus. Colleges and universities and high schools are important actors in the country, and if they sit down even behind a closed door with a congressional representative and say we're very concerned about this and we're watching it, that can only help.
Great, and let me remind everybody to go check out Steve's video presentation. It goes into a lot more detail, and even though it's from before the election, I think you'll find it very informative, and I think, Steve, you kindly put that out on our discussion forums as well.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, let me say again, Steve and Dan, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. We really appreciate it. We know you have a lot of demands on your time, and really want to thank you for this. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.